In this quick video, I just want to break down some terms that we use in psychology that kind of get used in the same way out in the world, but we actually gain a lot by being able to see how these words are different from each other. And those words are stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. And sometimes we use these words interchangeably, but I want to just quickly go over how they're different and what each of them means. And we can apply what psychologists sometimes call the ABCs to understanding what the differences are. The A stands for affect. The psychologists use this word differently than most people. You might see this and see the word affect, but when psychologists see this word, they pronounce it affect. And when they pronounce it that way, they mean feelings. So our affect is our mood, our feelings. Affective experience are our emotional experience, etc. So we can think of A for affect. We can also think of A for attitude. And that belongs to prejudice. So when we talk about prejudice, we're talking about our attitudes. And it really just means our overall positive or negative association with a particular social group. So if someone has a prejudice about a group, it means they generally see that group as positive or as negative. Usually when we use the word prejudice, we're thinking of the negative side of things, right? So if one group says, I hate this other group, right? If you think of anti-Semitism, right? We'd say that's a harsh negative prejudice about Jewish people. And that's usually the kind of prejudice that we're talking about, these negative prejudices. But you could have positive prejudices as well. If you go, oh, I love Canadians, that would be a positive prejudice, right? It's an overall, generally positive association that you have with that social group. So affect or attitude goes with prejudice. The B in our ABCs is behavior. These are the actions that we take, the choices that we make, how we treat other people. And discrimination is the behavioral side of this equation. So discrimination is what happens when you treat someone differently based on the group they belong to, right? So if there's a reliable pattern where someone is treating some people better or worse than others, and the primary difference between them is their social identity, their social category, the group that they belong to, we'd call that discrimination, right? So if you notice that someone at restaurants always tips white waiters higher than black waiters, that would be discrimination. This person hasn't necessarily said anything or thinks anything about this group, but what we're looking at are their actions. Their choice to tip a higher amount is being driven by the race of the person that's receiving that money. And that's just one example. So discrimination is what happens when our actions are biased by the social category that the other person belongs to. The final part of the ABCs is our C, which stands for cognition. In psychology, we use this word cognition to talk about thinking and what happens mentally, our beliefs and our thoughts. This is cognition. And that is what belongs to stereotypes. So stereotypes are beliefs we have about another group, the assumptions that we make, the expectations we have. So if we've come to associate Canadians with a smiling disposition, that's a stereotype, right? If I expect a Canadian to be a happy-go-lucky person just because they're Canadian, if that's all I know about them, I'm stereotyping, right? I have a belief about this group and the kind of people they are, and I'm using it to bias my expectations of a particular person because they belong to that group. So those are our ABCs. Prejudice, which is the attitude, overall positive or negative judgment of another group. Discrimination, which is our behavior, how we're acting in response to one group versus another. And stereotypes, the beliefs we have about the other group. Now, of course, I've made a big deal about how these three things are separate from each other, but oftentimes they're related, right? When someone has negative beliefs about a group, they expect them to act poorly. They think they have a bunch of negative qualities. That is likely to be associated with a negative prejudice toward that group, right? If I believe that you have all these bad qualities, I probably don't like you very much, right? So those two things would go together, but they don't have to, right? Someone can have a belief about a group that has nothing to do with prejudice, right? If I think Canadians smile a lot, okay, that's a stereotype, but it has no effect on whether I like this person or not because they are Canadian. You could also have prejudice and stereotyping without it necessarily leading to discrimination, although, sure, if people expect some groups to be mean or rude, their behavior toward those groups might be one of avoidance or not engaging very respectfully with them. And so, sure, people's behaviors can be tied to their stereotypes. Or if you don't like a particular group, you might act more rude or aggressively toward that group, right? So it makes logical sense that prejudice and stereotypes would be related to discrimination, but they don't have to be. People could have stereotypes, they could have prejudice, and not act on them, right? So again, these things can be separated from each other. And our job as psychologists is to understand those dynamics. When are they connected to each other? When are they not? But it's important for us not to lump all these three terms together, because when we distinguish them, the questions that we get to ask become a little more sophisticated and nuanced, and we get a better sense of how these things work. Okay, quick review. I'm going to show you a handful of statements that a person might make, and I want you to guess whether we're talking specifically about a stereotype that this person has or a prejudice that this person has. Number 1, let's say somebody says, librarians are old. Is that a stereotype or a prejudice? In this case, it's a stereotype. It's a belief somebody has about librarians. There's not necessarily any judgment in it. There's not necessarily any feelings in this. It's just somebody's expectation that if they meet a librarian, they're probably going to be older than someone in another occupation. Okay, number 2. Teenagers don't work hard. What is this? Stereotype or prejudice? In this case, we're talking again about a stereotype. It's a belief about teenagers. It's this expectation that people from this group don't work as hard. Sure, maybe that might lead to prejudice, but all by itself, this statement is not prejudice. It's just a stereotype. Okay, what about someone who says, I hate gamers? Stereotype or prejudice? Here we're talking prejudice. This is a judgment. They're not endorsing any belief about gamers. They're not saying what gamers are like or what characteristics they have. They're just saying that they don't like them. It's a negative prejudice toward this group. Okay, last one. Let's say someone says, I love Southerners. Is this a stereotype or a prejudice? Here we're talking prejudice, just like before. It's maybe modestly tricky because it's a positive prejudice, and it's not usually what we think of when we think about prejudice, but this person is not saying anything in particular about what Southerners are like or their characteristics or attributes. They're just saying they have an overall positive feeling about this group, and so therefore, we'd call that a prejudice. Okay, that's the difference between stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. Hopefully knowing the distinctions between these terms helps you identify them differently when you see it in the world around you, and as a result, you can appreciate some of the nuance behind the psychology of these three things, how they're related, and when they're related, and when they're not. For more social psychology, subscribe to this YouTube channel or check out my podcast at opinionsciencepodcast.com.